Hey folks, I wanted to make a little video here on something I've been trying to work out. So the scenario is um, I've got a Linux machine that doesn't have SSD installed, but I still need um, the ability to perform, you know, MFA for a user, like for example, SSH to that account. Now to take it one step further, I need that user account um, to not let me think how to phrase this. I want the Active Directory account. I don't want the account in Active Directory, first of all. However, that is not really possible. There is a way that you can have the account um, exist inside of Azure AD, um, and it exists inside of Active Directory, but they don't actually match. The passwords don't actually match, and you can still perform MFA. So why would I want to do that? I have a Linux machine, and the Linux machine is going to log in with, in this case, the name of the account is Linux Test. Okay, now Linux Test is only ever used on Linux machines, um, but I don't want to use that. I want to use my Azure MFA to perform MFA. I don't want to use the Google um, MFA. You got to set up on every single machine. Linux Test is an account that is used on 50 Linux servers, for example. So how can I perform MFA without having to set this up 50 times? So there is a little bit you got to set up. You got to tell the SSH daemon, for example, to do radius. But once that's there, there's really nothing else you got to do. And I have another video on how to do that. And so the thinking behind this was, okay, I don't really want this account to live inside of Active Directory, but that's not really a possibility in this scenario. Since it has to live in Active Directory, at least I don't want it to have the password that I'm going to be using. Okay, maybe that's an acceptable scenario. So there is a way to do this in this very unique situation. Um, it requires a couple of things. So we'll jump over here. Um, so we look at AD users and computers. This object called Linux test is in an OU that is not being synchronized um, with Azure AD Connect. So this object is not being pushed to Azure by my local Azure AD Connect instance. Now we can see the account Linux test, Nate Harris, Nate blah, blah, blah. All right, exists here. Now if I jump over to um, I need to cut this and jump over here to Azure AD. And let's refresh this. And you could say Linux test is an object that is not synchronized from Azure AD. Okay, the identity issuer here is my instance, my tenant. Okay, now, by the way, the password here, the password in Azure AD does not match the password on premise. Okay, so I'm going to show you it working, and then I'm going to show you what needed to be done for it to work. So I'm using anti-rad ping, pointing it to actually this NPS server. You can see I'm running a trace here. I'm filtering on just radius packets. We're going to send it, get the pop-up, and we get to accept. Okay, so let's see what was sent here. So the first thing to remember is in my scenario here, I'm only sending what is the SAM account name, so the short name. You can see down here, I have decrypted the password. It is not the real password. And we still end up, talking with, I can show you here. Let's go down till we find. So here's my request. This is us. Actually, this is the MPS server talking to the domain. The reason it's talking to the domain is not that it's performing primary authentication. This is actually the MFA DLL looking up this object. It needs to look up the object because it needs to find the UPN of that object so it knows what to send to Azure. All right, so then we go out and we do a query. We look up Azure. We start talking to Azure. And Azure, we set up a session. We send it to it. Azure says, yep, you're good to go. And we send back to our Radius client and access accept. So what needed to have been done? So I tried this a couple of ways. So inside of a connection request policy, you have the ability to just say accept users without validating credentials. So this means I'm not even going to bother talking to the domain to perform primary authentication. I'm just going to accept it. Now the condition in here is I've matched this specific user, both the UPN and the short name. And I'll show you why I had the UPN in here before. The problem is that when I sent the UPN, it was failing. And if you go into the MFA logs, what you'll see is it was saying that, let's go down here to, this is one attempt when I was using a UPN. It's trying to retrieve a UPN, but it's saying that this is the actual username. So when I'm using the UPN, it doesn't do any kind of translation to the account name. MPS doesn't translate the name when it does a handoff to Azure MFA. And I believe what happens is because it doesn't change it in any way, it gives it to it in exactly the format that it was received. And because of that, it is actually in a format it doesn't recognize, like UTF or something along those lines, because this is exactly the same sort of wingding characters you'd see if the password had been wrong and the and primary authentication had failed. And anyway, there's another video on that too. You'll see when this kind of happens. So what I did instead was, instead of sending the UPN, I started sending, if we go back up here, what time is that? 2:57:24. 2:57, there we go. You see here I'm sending the UPN and that fails. And it fails because it says, say this DLL says no. That DLL is the Azure MFA DLL. Now, if we go up some to others, okay, so here is another one where I'm just sending the SAM account name. It still fails. So I started wondering, why is that? Now I have worked other cases where it's very weird the way MPS kind of does its thing. But what I started to think is because it's not doing any actual translation of the user, it's not reformatting it. So when whatever format it's sent to, it's just simply handing that off to the MFA DLL. So what I did is inside of my connection request policy, I did a very simple realm translate. And essentially what this is this right here is saying pretty much anything slash anything. What I want you to do is stick the name of this test domain is Nathar 2016. Stick Nathar 2016 slash in front of the username. $2 is the username here. And what that does is it actually then reformats the user account name before it does a handoff to the MFA DLL. And then so what you get is now we're sending the same thing. We're still sending just the SAM account name, but now obviously it's working. We can see it's working. So this is a very unique, case where this might help anybody, but for those instances where you need to perform MFA, but you don't want the account credentials, valid account credentials on premise, and you still want to be able to perform MFA, so you have that account inside of Azure AD with the setup, has the right credentials so you can go through and do the configure MFA for the account. This is a scenario where you could actually get that working. So hopefully this helps somebody. If not, I understand it's kind of kludgy, but it's free. You have a good day.